Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to talk you through how I created this entire track from scratch. We'll start by discussing the foundational elements and talk through all of the developmental stages in between the beginning and the end of the piece. This will provide you with insight into the process of creating a full piece of music from nothing, giving you a look into key components such as mixing, arrangement, transitions, effects, sound selection and so on. Let's start by playing the song through. Feel free to skip ahead if you wish. Let's start things off by talking about the key compositional elements and how they were formed. The foundation of this piece is the sine melody that is prominent throughout the song. It revolves around a 4-note minor progression where each note hits on the start of each consecutive beat. There is quite a lot of space between each time the progression occurs. I often like to utilise relative silence in music to create a more dynamically pleasing composition, where lead elements are given their own individual space to breathe in the overall mix. Stretching out the silence can also help to create tension, and it can also create a sense of impact at key transition points. The next 4 bars introduce a change in the progression. The first 4 notes of this change provide somewhat of a sense of contrast, as they are more major in their appearance. Let me demonstrate by playing them. After these 4 notes, we have a descending C and then a B. These 2 notes send us back down into a minor progression, returning the darker mood of the song. So let's play all 4 bars together. Now let's play through the next part of the progression before discussing the additional changes. I've kept the core foundational melody the same as it was, just at a slightly faster pace, but you will notice the addition of higher notes. These notes play in a higher register to further contrast the melody and create distinction. They are more sparse in their frequency of playing, with typically only 1 note playing per bar. You will notice that they play in an ascending pattern too, which helps build up tension. This is quite a dominant sound with all of its effects applied, and so I don't want to overdo the top melody. Otherwise, the saturation you hear may begin to convolute the pattern. The entire progression itself is really quite simple in essence. More complex composition and theoretical applications don't always lead to more interesting and engaging music. I often prefer to create interest in character based on the sonic textures applied to the song, as opposed to the theory of the composition itself. Now let's look briefly at the synth itself. For this sound, I've used phase plant. There is nothing fancy about the design. It's just a simple sine waveform combined with a triangle. The cutoff is modulated slightly to provide a subtle sense of movement as well. The main design, so to speak, comes from the external application of effects in this sound. Let me play it with all of the effects removed. Let's go through each effect one by one. The first effect I used is Echo Boy. This is what I call the colouring trick, but it's not exclusive to Echo Boy. In fact, you can use a range of different plugins to colour your sound without actually using them for the purpose they were designed for, i.e. in this case, delay. I have a full video on how to do this, which we will link to in the description rather than dive into here, or you can find it within our free video section on Zeverb. The next Echo Boy in slot 2 wasn't actually used in the end, so let's open up the instance of Reactor. This is a Reactor plugin called the VHS Audio Degradation Suite. If you own Reactor, you can download it for free. This plugin emulates some of the pitch artifacts and fuzzy saturation associated with the likes of tape, and can really help to give your sound a warm saturation all the way to completely mangling the fidelity of the audio. Here I've used it to add further distortion and a subtle hint of pitch modulation. A nice feature of this plugin is the additional mic emulation options you can choose from. Again, this is free for all Reactor users, so definitely check it out if you own Reactor. Next we have an instance of Soothe 2. Soothe 2 is a dynamic resonance suppressor. It identifies problematic resonances on the fly and applies matching reduction automatically. This results in a smoother, more balanced sound and saves you from having to notch out frequencies by hand. This is something I use often for mixing applications, and I'm sure we will cover it more extensively at some stage down the line. I've used it here just to tame some of the lower resonant frequencies, as the song is quite busy in the low to mid region, and making sure everything is controlled is conducive to achieving a clean mix. The next two plugins weren't used ultimately either, so let's enable the limiter beneath those. This was just used to activate sidechain later on in the song when the chorus drops and things get particularly busy, and helped to keep the sound under control, which gives room for other elements. Next we have a compressor in the form of FabFilter Pro C2. This applies a subtle compression to the sound, but it is only activated in certain sections of the song where other elements are present. Turning compression on and off strategically is a good way to reduce the dynamics in busy sections of the song, whilst not compromising the dynamic integrity of the sound on its own. Then we have another instance of Soothe. To be honest, this instance isn't particularly necessary, and I could have just increased the value of the first one, but I made this decision later on in the song and used it to apply further resonance reduction in the context of the full mix. Then we have one final instance of Echo Boy, which is used for its intended purpose. This creates a delay at the end of the track during the outro. The reason I have only activated it during the outro is because there is space available for it. For example, you wouldn't want this delay occurring during a busy chorus, otherwise things would get too messy. On a send track, I've placed a reverb. This enhances the atmosphere of the sound dramatically, but also preserves the transience of the original sound by separating both the dry and wet signals. By placing the reverb on a separate mixer send track, we have greater control over each signal and can create a better blend of the two. I have also placed an instance of Soothe 2 underneath the reverb. The addition of reverb can sometimes become a mixing issue with an overly atmospheric sound like this, and present problems such as swamping other sounds, and so taming its resonance is one of the measures I take to control it. You could also EQ the reverb, and I often suggest removing the lower end of the spectrum from reverb, as well as some of the harsher high-end frequencies. Both of these frequency regions can cause rather undesirable results when reverb is applied to them and not controlled properly. Underneath this sound melody, we have a piano melody playing in the more built-up sections. These notes punctuate the original melody and add new texture and variation to the sound. Layering multiple sounds on top of one another can enrich your music significantly, but you do have to be mindful of each element's place in the context of the full piece. For example, the piano and sound occupy similar frequency terrain on the spectrum, and I don't want to detract too much from the lead sound melody, so this piano is only included in certain segments of the song, as well as being mixed to sound like it's underneath the sound instead of trying to overpower it. The only effect on the piano is this reverb. As you can see, it has quite atmospheric settings with the long decay time, but you'll notice I was mindful of the frequency content and have cut things down significantly. Underneath the lead melody, we have a bed of atmospheric and ambient soundscapes. Most of these come from my sample packs, which are included in our latest FL Studio course on Zeverb, and we're pretty much working exclusively with audio here. We will, however, have atmospheric sound design courses, and you can already find some of these videos within our Melodic Safari course. I'm going to play each one independently to give you an idea of what the individual components within this entire section sound like, and how the power of layering is at play again here. Now here's some of it combined. Although there are multiple elements here, none overpower the more prominent parts of the song. Instead, you can think of this as a sort of atmospheric current that runs through the background of the song with an aim to create this sort of ethereal and dreamy soundscape. All of this texture serves to enhance the warmth and character of the track in a rather inconspicuous way. Let's give you an example of how you might process a sound like this. Here I've used EQ and reverb to enhance the quality of the sound. If I play it without effects enabled, you'll notice that it is quite heavy and drone-like. The low cut on the EQ removes the unwanted rumble portion of the sound, and the reverb brightens things and gives it an entirely new atmosphere. Similar processing is used across the spectrum of ambient sounds in this track. I've also used environmental sounds to reinforce the atmosphere, adding a more organic texture to the song. These environmental sounds are often referred to as Foleys. In this track, I've used a combination of rain, thunder and white noise to give the song a bit more life. Again, these elements are layered together and work well in combination with one another. Here's what it sounds like. Foleys can help to bring the song into a more lifelike setting by using real-world sounds on top of the music. They can also help tell a story or set a scene within a song. For example, using sounds like door creaks, crowd noise, or ambient street sounds can place the listener in a particular setting, aligning with the lyrics or the theme of the music. Next, I've used some string harmonics. String harmonics tend to make for interesting additions to atmospheric songs like this. They are harmonically complex and rich in overtones, which can blend well with other instruments. They also tend to have an airy, ethereal quality, which contrasts the more full sound of regular strings. String harmonics blend well with synths and electronic textures because of their glassy, pure tones. Next we have the vocals. I've used some cinematic style vocal samples that I purchased from Splice, and these kind of vocals are often highly expressive and evocative, which aligns well with the richness and ethereal soundscapes of more ambient leaning music. The vocals can be processed with reverb, delay, or other effects to blend seamlessly into the atmosphere, becoming a part of the sonic environment rather than taking a dominant role. Vocals always tend to make music feel more personal and emotional, even if the lyrics are absent or minimal. It's also good practice to find a nice balance between organic and synthetic sounds. As you'll see here, there is a lot of low end removed to make them sound more airy, and the delay has lots of wet mix signal and feedback to enhance the atmospheric quality of the vocals. Vocals in this track are used more texturally as opposed to having a dominant role, so it's quite safe to apply this much processing. If you want to see how I process vocals like chopping, doubling, enhancing, processing harmonies, etc., then you can find out in our Melodic Safari series. So let's just do a quick recap of the elements we've covered so far to hear how the atmosphere and lead melody blend together in this context. Next we have the sub-bass. For the more ambient sections of this song, I've used an incredibly simple sub-bass created using an analog style sine wavetable in Serum. Sound design doesn't get much simpler than this, but oftentimes we don't need to complicate things. Sine waves tend to be pure in nature, and so they make for a great textural addition to the low regions of a song's frequency spectrum. Sub-bass frequencies are felt more than heard, providing a physical sensation that adds depth to the mix. In ambient music, where space and atmosphere are key elements, sub-bass helps to expand the soundscape, making the music feel more immersive. It can also act as a foundation that grounds the mix, providing a counterbalance to the lighter, airier elements, ensuring that the track feels full and well-rounded without sounding too thin. Listen to a before and after to demonstrate my points. Next we have the drums and percussion. This is divided into two sections, where one is for the initial drop and the other signals the beginning of a change in the drop, increasing the tension and energy. Let's play each section through, and afterwards I'll break down the individual components to show you how everything was created and put together. Let's start at the beginning. To introduce the drum section, I took an 808 and reversed it in order to create a gradual sweep into the drop. You can repurpose kick drums and 808s like this to create variation, interest and movement throughout your drum sections, turning them into more transitional elements. Listen to it here with the kick drum activated. You'll see that I've used a rather slow pattern for the kick, and the reason for this is because I wanted to create a stark contrast between each drum section. The initial drop is slower paced but still heavy hitting, and when the 4 on the floor pattern arrives in the second section, it creates much more impact due to the increase in pace and therefore energy. The kick drum is the fundamental component of most drum sections and the element in which we tend to centre the rest of the parts around, so feel free to think of this as the foundation for all the drums. I also layered the kick drum with an 808. This falls into the same foundational category as the kick drum, but it also serves an additional purpose in the sense that it acts like the track's main bass line at this stage. I've removed the sub bass from this section so that the two elements don't clash with one another. 808s provide a deep sub bass frequency that fills the low end of the frequency spectrum, creating a heavy, rumbling bass that drives the track. The punchy attack combined with the long, sustained low end tail makes them ideal for creating bass lines that are both impactful and resonant. They are widely used in modern production and oftentimes replace the need for a bass line altogether. Next, I repurposed the original 808 kick drum to create a more high-pitched and rhythmic part. This creates an interplay between the kick and the original 808, utilising shorter notes and a quicker pace, and sets a more percussive mood overall. Because 808s tend to be quite tonal in nature, I've created somewhat of a melody from this. The kick drum, by comparison, doesn't have an obvious central tone, so it doesn't necessarily need to change notes to fit into the composition. Some producers will consider tuning their kicks to work with the overall composition, but it's always going to be context dependent. Next, I've introduced these snares. The snares are composed of 4 layers. 2 of these are more textural and atmospheric, so let's talk through the process of building these up. Here they are with no effects applied. First, I've used an instance of FabFilter Volcano to filter the sounds. This removes the high-end content, which sets it up for the next stage of adding the more atmospheric effects. Without the removal of these high frequencies, the atmospheric effects would likely sound way too harsh, and I'll demonstrate that in just a minute. Following the filter on the chain, we have an instance of Soundtoys Effect Rack. This uses a combination of saturation and tremolo, although it has a rather subtle effect. Then we have a quarter note delay, which begins to enhance the atmosphere and also the rhythm. Finally, we have the reverb to tie it all together. Typically, I use controlled reverb on snares as they tend to be quite a prominent element. This means cutting the low and high end from the reverb signal and not overdoing the decay times. Now listen to how the snare sounds without the filtering. Next we have the third layer, which is the dominant snare. This has lots of punchy compression and a reverb on the send track to preserve the transient. I tend to put reverb on a send track when working with the main snare, as you want to make sure it cuts through the mix without the reverb signal smoothing the initial transient. Again, make sure your reverb is controlled. You'll see I've used a Pro Q after the reverb on the effect chain to carve out a region of the signal that works well in the context of the full mix, not overpowering anything. Something also worth noting here is that I've used what is technically a delay plugin to create the reverb. Valhalla Delay is, as the name entails, a delay plugin, but by turning the diffusion parameter to full, you will create a highly diffused, reverberated sound that no longer resembles a delay. What this essentially means is that you can take some of this plugin's unique modes and apply them as reverb instead. Of course, you can also extrapolate this idea across other plugins you might have in your toolkit. Then we have the final snare, which is used to add embellishment to the pattern and create more rhythm and variation. For this, I've used an instance of Labs Vintage Drums, which is a free library from Spitfire Audio. This is also a nice addition for the fact that libraries like this often have something called round robin, meaning that every note or sound has been sampled at different velocity layers. This means that you can achieve variation within each note, making things less monotonous and more interesting. Audio samples don't have this feature, so it can often be good practice to integrate some libraries or even recorded drums into your sections. Then we start introducing hats. Hi-hats provide a steady rhythmic foundation that helps guide the flow of a track. Whether it's through rapid, complex patterns or more minimalistic, spaced-out hits, hi-hats maintain the tempo and pulse of the song, giving structure to the rhythm section. By varying the timing and velocity of hi-hats, producers can add a sense of groove or swing to a track. Subtle shifts in the placement of hi-hats, such as slightly ahead or behind the beat, can create feelings of push or pull, making the rhythm feel more human and less robotic. This helps inject energy and momentum, particularly in genres like hip-hop, trap and house. With that in mind, I also added an instance of the Labs drums again, only this time using the hi-hats to avail of the round robin and to create a more human sound. Next, I have a little all-in-one trick. This is a full 2-bar render of the drum section that I've applied some filtering to, and it's used exclusively at key transition points. In this case, I use it to lead us into the mini bridge before the second drop, and changes like this are useful to signal that something different is about to occur. What's going on here is that I have a MIDI channel linked to this plugin from Native Instruments called the Finger, and these MIDI notes are triggering different effects to occur within the plugin each time they're played. There are many similar glitch-like plugins on the market, and if you've picked up our definitive FL Studio course, you'll have access to these sorts of course resources. Now we move on to the second drum section. To switch things up, I changed the kick and 808 pattern to play 4 on the floor rhythm. This increases the intensity of things and provides an impactful contrast to the first section. Since the pace is more rapid here, I've been mindful to apply sidechain compression to the 808 so that it ducks out of the way each time the kick drum hits. This helps to avoid clashing and also enhances the sense of rhythm. I've also removed 3 layers of the snare for this section as it's quite busy. I felt like the Labs layer worked best for the rhythm and mood here. I've also added an offbeat open hi-hat to hit in between each beat, which helps to increase the pace and drive the drums forward. These kinds of offbeat hats, although simple, can really enhance the momentum. And here's everything together. Let's just listen back to everything turned on to hear the drums in the context of the full song. Now we're going to move on to the main lead of this chorus. This sound is just a preset for an omnisphere, but the magic happens in the processing. First, let's play it through. Now let's hear it without the processing. First, I added an immediate instance of compression just to tame things right off the bat. Then I added decapitator. This is where the bulk of the processing occurs. I have enabled the punish mode to really overdrive the sound and add a ton of distortion. Following that, we have a bit crusher. This adds a new dynamic layer of distortion that enhances the character of the sound, giving it somewhat of a cool digital effect. I've also added some reverb to increase the atmosphere. I've left the high end open on this particular instance of reverb, as I felt like it helped to make the lead stand out more, but I always cut the extreme lows from the reverb signal. Then we have another instance of compression. It can often be a good idea to apply compression at various stages of the effect chain. This is because some effects can completely change the dynamics of a sound, and the first compressor will no longer work on its own. A good practice might also be to utilize different compressor models, adding the character of each module for further variation. Then I added even more distortion to push it that little bit further. All of this distortion started to introduce some unwanted low end, so I used an EQ to remove this. Finally, I used a limiter to sidechain the lead to the same rhythm as the kick drum. This enhances the overall rhythm of the track significantly. Moving back to the beginning, I also layered some of the atmosphere with these deep choir chords. I've always loved utilising choirs in ambient sections, as they tend to add a human touch on top of the more synthesized elements, and breathy articulations like this blend in extremely well. On top of these, I have a horn sample that I've cut up and changed the pitch around on. I thought this was a somewhat unique and interesting sound to implement, even if it is relatively subtle in the grand scheme of things. Let's take a quick look at how this sound was processed. Here's the original sample. And here's how it's processed. I've added a little alto buoy that puts the pitch up an octave and also increases the formant shifting. This is an interesting plugin because even though it's intended to work on monophonic vocal sources, you can achieve interesting textures and artifacts by putting it on other sources outside of vocals, even polyphonic sounds. The Echo Buoy and Valhalla add a ton of atmosphere to the sound as well. You can see that there are 3 cloned samples. Each one of these is tuned differently to create a sort of melody from the sound. The original sample contains only 2 notes, but by using this trick we can change the pitch of different parts of the sample to make it more melodic and varied. Next up we have the Irish Flute. This is another prominent element within the song. There is a fair amount of processing occurring in this sound, so let's explore it. First, let's hear it with the effects disabled. The first 3 effects here are Soothe, Echo Buoy and Vintage Verb. The latter 2 are used to simply further enhance the atmosphere in line with the rest of the song, and Soothe takes out some of the high-end resonance as I found it was a bit too sharp initially. Then we have some plugins to tame and sidechain. A little bit of compression was used here, as well as an additional instance of Soothe to hit more of the mid region this time. Later in the song, the flute takes on a different face, and here I've applied glitching and tremolo to enhance the rhythm in line with the drums. I've used the likes of Native Instruments Finger again, as well as Soundtoys Tremolator, to add different patterned rhythms and glitches. These are triggered and automated on and off to vastly change the character of the sound and add a ton of variety, completely transforming the mood. Let's hear it with everything else on. Let's take a look now at some more of the string parts. First of all, I have a more conventional patch that plays a chord progression, and this is from one of the Oliver Arnold Spitfire libraries. These work particularly well with the choir section, adding a nice contrast in terms of register. I tend to be mindful of the chord progressions present at any given moment and how, instead of layering progressions using the same registers and notes, it often makes more sense to combine different registers and variations of the melody or progression in order to create a fuller sound. I also have some violin played in a sul tasto articulation. Sul tasto is a technique in which the bow is drawn closer to or directly over the fingerboard. This results in a softer, more delicate, and more often ethereal sound, as compared to the typical brighter tone produced when bowing near the bridge. This kind of articulation complements the nature of ambient music very well. To contrast this, I also have a violin arpeggio that begins at the bridge into the second part of the drop. This acts as a nice counter melody to the main lead and helps to create more interest by combining traditional instrumentation with the more modern style of synth production. Now listen to it with everything involved. The use of filtering in and out creates more dynamic variation in the arrangement too, and helps to keep things interesting. I also sidechained this melody in line with the rest of the piece. Next up is another one of these all-in-one tricks I like to utilise. This is a render of several components from the main progression. Let me play the original render for you first. As you can see here, the clips are chopped up, and to do this I used the native FL Studio chop feature, which can be accessed in the upper left of an audio clip. From here you can find a list of presets that will automatically chop up the selected audio clip. Here's what it sounds like in this instance. You can see I cut several frequencies from this render. This is primarily because the chorus is already so busy, and this render had a lot of both low and high energy that would have left less room for the more dominant elements in the chorus if left unchecked. With the sound included in this render, I also noticed that there were a lot of resonant peaks in the mid-region. Many of the most important elements in a mix, such as vocals, guitars, synths and drums, occupy the mid-range. When too many instruments or sounds compete in this area, it can lead to a muddy, cluttered or indistinct mix. This overcrowding makes it difficult for individual elements to stand out, resulting in a mix that lacks clarity and definition. Masking occurs when sounds in similar frequency ranges overlap and drown each other out, making it harder to hear certain elements clearly. For instance, a lead vocal and a guitar might compete for space in the mid-range, causing one or both to lose clarity. This results in important parts of the mix, such as the vocals or melodic instruments, getting buried under other elements. The final compositional elements of this track are the transitional effects. These are the likes of sweeps, impacts, risers, and various effects that are used to transition between key points in the song. Transitional effects are useful because they can be used to signal a change in pace and direction, or they can be used to simply add variation and keep things interesting. They are often used at 4 or 8 bar intervals and help to keep things from stagnating or feeling monotonous. In the example I'm about to play, I've used a combination of various risers and impacts to signal the ending of the final chorus, which then leads into the outro. This is obviously a pivotal point of the track and helps to add a sense of resolution to the piece. You will notice that some of these sounds have a lot of low-end frequency content, such as the impact. I tend to keep the likes of impacts exclusive to sections where the kick and bass are absent. This is because impacts are often dominant in low frequencies, and reserving them helps to avoid any potential clashes. Here it is with everything on. So that just about sums up the compositional elements of the song. In my definitive FL Studio Masterclass course, we take a deep dive into things like arrangement and mixing, but let's discuss some of the thoughts and ideas behind the arrangement of this particular track. We begin with the intro. This is a rather sparse section that teases the main progression, but in a more reserved and subtle way that doesn't include the major elements. Keeping an intro relatively sparse, but with hints of things to come, can help to build up anticipation and tension. You don't always want to give away too much in the beginning of a song, although it has become somewhat of a modern trend to go all in at the beginning of a song to get as much reaction as possible from the listener. There may be cases where using this sort of startling method is effective, but it's all context dependent. Let's just play through the intro. Next we have what might be considered the first verse, although this term is more closely associated with songs that have generic structures such as pop music with vocals. This section introduces new elements such as a top melody to enhance the foundational sine melody. It also fills a frequency void by introducing the sub-bass, which until now was a region with no presence. Next up is the second half of the verse, or perhaps more accurately, a pre-chorus. This section introduces the lead flute, giving prominence to it by removing other elements such as the top melody and some atmospheric components. The removal of these elements allows the lead to shine through in its own space and gives it a central focus from the listener's perspective. The pre-chorus often introduces musical or lyrical tension that creates excitement and anticipation for the chorus. This section usually ramps up the energy, preparing listeners for the emotional and melodic payoff of the chorus. For example, the chord progression might change or the melody might rise in pitch, creating a sense of build-up. The pre-chorus helps provide a smooth transition from the verse, which is often more subdued, into the chorus, which is typically the most energetic and impactful part of the song. Without a pre-chorus, the transition can feel abrupt and the chorus might not hit as powerfully. Next we have a bridge. As the name entails, this bridges the gap between the pre-chorus and the main chorus. The vast majority of this bridge section is actually relative silence. You will notice that the majority of elements drop out. The reason for doing this is to help create a sense of contrast between the sections and also to provide a larger impact when the chorus kicks in. Next is the arrival of the chorus. This is the main section of the song and introduces the arrival of several new and prominent elements such as the drums, glitchy synths and the processing of the flute. The chorus typically contains the main hook, which is the most memorable and catchy part of the song. This is the section that the listeners are most likely to remember and sing along to. It often has simple, repetitive melody and lyrics that stick in people's minds, making it the most recognisable part of the track. Next we have another bridge. This time around the bridge is leading up to the second half of the chorus. This bridge is particularly important because it is building up to the most intense part of the song, where the arrival of new pacing, synths and melodies are all introduced. Some of the central elements drop out here, such as the drums and bass, to help create dynamic contrast, and again more impact when they are reintroduced. I have the violin arpeggio being gradually filtered in over the course of 4 bars to add further anticipation. This is layered with the main lead as well, which is also automated in over the same time period. Introducing 2 elements at once can be a way to engage your listener and keep their interest held. At the same time, you don't want it to sound too abrupt, hence the use of filtering and automation. Next we have the final section of the chorus. This is the most intense and uplifting portion of the track, combining multiple key elements together in order to create a highly engaging sound. For the first 12 bars of this section, I've kept the focus on the new violin and lead synth, giving them their own respective time to shine, and after that the flute is reintroduced as a layer. All 3 elements work synergistically here. There's tons of sidechain compression used in order to achieve a dynamic and pumping sound that really enhances the overall mood. The drums change pace to incorporate a 4-in-the-floor rhythm, in contrast to the slower pace of the first half of the chorus. This change amplifies the energy even further. And finally, we have the outro. The outro harkens back to the sort of sparse and atmospheric feeling we experienced in the intro, signalling the end of the song and a resolution to everything. The outro begins with 4 bars of relative silence, contrasting the highly energetic mood of the chorus with the softness of the ending. This helps to change the listener's emotional state and perception of the music. The outro gradually grows more and more sparse as elements weave in and out, giving you the sense that everything is winding down and coming to a close. This just about sums up everything we set out to cover in the course. I really hope you've enjoyed watching through it, and hopefully you'll come away with knowledge you can implement in your own music. If you like this video, you're going to love my new music academy, Zeverb. I've just launched a 10-hour music masterclass packed with lifetime free updates, project files, samples, presets, MIDI files, and so much more. You can also join our growing Discord community, where you can meet and discuss music production with other artists, producers, and creators. We're just getting started with even more content on the way. We really hope to see you there. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.